Welcome to episode 27 of the Skadi Podcast. On this episode, we are getting into the world of career changes, where ordinary individuals take extraordinary leaps. Our guest today, Niral Kalaria, is telling the story how he embraced change and found fulfillment in new paths. We hope you enjoy.
Great. So, Damian, we're going to take a bit of a trip away or a step away from the kind of episodic podcasts that we've been putting out recently, because we're getting into career season, I guess. There's a lot of people thinking about, their careers. They're either leaving school or leaving university or college, I guess. Also, there are people probably at this time of year, let's be honest, we've been there, thinking about a change as well. So we've gone for a few podcasts now which have a focus on people's careers, right?
Yeah, I think that's what we're looking to achieve. I think we'll try and speak to some varying different people to see where they've ended up or how they've ended up where they've got to. You might start off down one route and then end up turning left very sharply and ending up in a completely different career from what you started off. And I think that hopefully we'll be able to show that maybe decisions you make now have no real bearing necessarily on where you will end up. The paths are always open in front of you.
Absolutely. And I think we've all experienced some change. And I think no one's career is typical. We're really lucky today because we're inviting Niral Kalaria into Skadi. Niral's here. Welcome to the podcast, Niral. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for having me.
And Niral, you've had a really interesting career path, which I can't wait to get into. But latterly, you are the Chief Ethics Officer at DWS.
That's right.
And when I look back at your pathway, there's been such a journey to arrive there. And that's not even the end of the story. That's just where you happen to be now. And you're very much looking forward to, where the future may lie as well. So I guess we'll jump straight into it. So first of all, you were educated at Colgate.
Mm-hmm.
You took a BA in philosophy and economics. You're from the US system. I'm not. I'm from the UK system. So what I wanted to understand, because you then decided to go to law school, if you'd have graduated as you did in 1992, could you have gone on a career then, or what was the decision process for you back then?
Sure, happy to discuss that, and hopefully people will find this of value. So look, I called myself the inadvertent lawyer. Going to university in the States, having grown up, my father was a surgeon. We had lots of medical professionals in the family. So it was sort of preordained, and I was happy to be heading towards a career in medicine. When I got to school at university and I started studying economics and philosophy, it sort of dawned on me that I should consider an alternate path potentially, as opposed to going down the preordained path. And that sort of led me to think, what are my strengths? What do I like to do? I like to communicate. I like to express myself. And so in some ways, in talking to my friends at the time, it was decided that, law school may be a good way for me to sort of align my strengths to my aspirations. And from that perspective, my parents were, I was sort of first generation Asian. So long as grad school was involved, they were okay with it, I think. So that took me down the path of law school. Of course, a lot of my colleagues then and people graduating now, they often go directly into the workforce, oftentimes into the corporate workforce. And there's certainly a lot of choices for them across technology, finance, research, what have you. So for me, however, it seemed that seemed the optimal initial step forward for my professional journey.
And what do you think? What about you equipped you for law? Do you think what was it sort of? What were those kind of, what were your strong suits? And actually, I'd love to know where did you go? My God, why on earth have I chosen this? This isn't for me. Were there any of those moments at all?
As to why I went to law school, I think my parents would have found me to be a very talkative and argumentative child. So that certainly was one basis to think I should go to law school. But equally, like I said, you get to law school, you obviously have doubts. It's a very competitive atmosphere, particularly in New York City. I went to the Fordham University School of Law, which is a very, very good school. So you have a lot of people wanting to succeed. You're in graduate school mode, so people are really focused. So there are days when I thought, geez, this is quite cutthroat, and will I be able to persevere through this? But by staying focused and trusting your instincts, I was able to sort of get through that first challenge of going to law school.
And that proximity, that being in New York, is that how you then made the decision to go to the SEC? Because I was quite shocked at how quick, you sort of, you make this choice for law, and then you go like, securities are the thing for me, and you move into, I think it's the enforcement area. I mean, that's pretty, full on so quick. Yeah. I don't think that would be a similar pathway in the UK. I think it would be, things would be very different. You'd probably do a bit more with a firm, I think. Why does it work out, or why did it work out like that for you?
Sure. Well, being in New York obviously was a preference because a lot of commerce and a lot of legal related activity in New York is one of the global hubs. So I think that was definitely a plus. As far as the SEC, look, a side story, which is true. One of my favorite movies at the time, and certainly one of my movies still, is the original Wall Street. And in that, of course, you have Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen. And I like this sort of fast-paced world of financial markets, but then also wanting to be a good guy. I thought, okay, well, what will I do coming out of law school? And that brought me to thinking about government work, as opposed to a lot of my peers that were taking first-year jobs out of law school with the large firms. Going to make a lot more money. But from my perspective, it was an opportunity to get into an area where you felt like you were giving back to the world, at least in a high level, and then also do something interesting, get a lot more experience more quickly. So that was the pivot to the SEC. So certainly far more financially constrained than going directly to a big law firm, but got to do some amazing work straight out of the gate.
And that kind of amazing work, I mean, if you're put into the SEC at that kind of age, what's responsibility like?
Yeah, so the responsibility, it certainly is a range. You obviously are very much a green thumb, so you come in and you have to learn the basics. But I think that the reality is that the government tends to, on balance, be leanly staffed. I know people may argue with that, but certainly in this sort of context, you are leanly staffed. So when there is sort of a big flow of investigative activity, you naturally are going to work with your seniors, but you oftentimes are going to find yourself having to do a lot more relative to your peers at the law firms at the same age. So an example would be, in the 3.5 years I was at the SEC, I did 65 depositions, of which I probably chaired about 20. Now, to get that many depositions under your belt in private legal practice, you'd probably have to be there 6-7 years. So it was really an ability to really get into the nitty-gritty, the substance of things. And it was scary. I mean, I remember, distinctly having to take a testimony or a deposition under oath of a partner from one of the big accounting firms who had been a partner longer than I'd been alive. And it was clear that I wasn't in charge of that deposition because I was not an expert and he was. However, I learned a lot in sort of learning how you show resolve, how you understand that you don't understand that much, and potentially ask the right questions and find a solution.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because I'm sure a lot of people who are making these decisions, and I know we've had this, Damian, in our careers, where there's a point where you arrive and you add so much value because you have certain skills that other people in the workforce don't have. And I think, for us, it was very much our kind of ability to use, Excel spreadsheets and really make a difference around some of the calculations. But there is also very much, you're very conscious that there are people around you that have so much more experience. And how long into it, maybe this didn't happen at the SEC, I don't know, you were there 3 years. Was there a point where you sort of felt like, hey, I think I've got this. I think I know what I'm doing here, rather than, whoa, I'm swimming in deep water where, do you know that feeling? Do you know
Sure.
what I mean?
No, that's right. And I think by the end of that, 3-year tenure, I would say that I definitely felt more confident in the process and how one goes about doing it in an effective manner, that is, doing enforcement work across securities markets in an effective manner. But I think you always take away being a government-trained professional, or in this case, a government-trained attorney. You were always going to be self-reflective. You're always going to be questioning to make sure that you come out with the right outcomes and not just presuppose an outcome. And I think the government teaches you, better or worse, to be skeptical. And I think that skepticism throughout the things I've done that followed has held me in good stead.
And that training that you mentioned, you say government trained, is that a formal training, or is that really kind of apprenticeship style? You're learning from people around you that have this experience. How is that training passed to somebody, at that level?
I think it's passed across a couple of dimensions, right? The first one is that you are definitely getting involved in the substance, right? Whereas in other places, when you have big private clients, you're going to be very gentle in what you give the junior people to do. I mean, here you're asked to really analyze and put forward a view. Correspondingly, you actually get to go to, in this case, I got to go to federal court with my seniors, and in one or two instances, the seniors couldn't make it. So there I was, green thumb that I was at that age, and you are, learning, in real time. You're in federal court. You're arguing a motion, not in the fancy suits that my peers across the private firms across the side of the courthouse were wearing, but nonetheless, you learn, by being involved in the substance quicker and more deeply, an actual real time trial by fire, right? I mean, you just that's it, and that's a liberty the government can take. To be fair to the private practitioners, right? I mean, when you're representing clients as opposed to the government, both have to be careful and professional. But in one case, I think you have to be, additively more thoughtful in who's going to represent the client and how you're going to do it. So there's some, let's say, latitude that you get in the learning.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. So then you did move into private practice afterwards.
That's right.
What caused the change there? What was that? What steered that for you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there was two aspects to that. The first is it's a natural progression. I think that typically some people will stay on in government practice for a lot longer. But I think the normal course is to move into private practice, leverage what you've learned, hopefully go in at a more seasoned level. So you are actually getting into the substance when you get there, or at least some of the substance. You're still not that senior. And I wasn't, because I was only a fourth year. But at the same time, look, I'd be joking I would be kidding if I didn't say that money does matter to a degree, and government salaries are not what private practice paid. My wife was a pharmacist, and then we had our first daughter. She and I agreed that she would be at home. So obviously, in balancing some of the financial realities, that also was a catalyst to go into private practice.
So when you enter private practice and you make that change from being in a kind of government workforce, if you like, how do you pick up, and I'm imagining there's a sort of, you've got to pick up a commercial sense about you, because things aren't just delivered in front of you. Whereas in the government, obviously, there's a steady stream of workflow that has to be executed. Private practice, you've got to go out and win it to a certain extent, right? I mean, I don't mean win the case, I just mean win the business in the first place. That's
right. Yeah, you definitely take on a client-centric perspective, which, as you said, the client otherwise had been the government, and the work automatically comes to you or is assigned to you. In this case, granted, you're still not the senior partner dealing with the clients, but you are going to have to, appeal to the client. You're going to have to win over the client. You're going to have to manage that relationship. The work product that you give, even though it might be vetted by seniors, is going to reflect upon you to the client. So that sort of added pressure and added layer of scrutiny and expectation, I should say, that is something that you definitely have to adapt to. And that, for me, that was a bit of a learning curve, and learning more about how to think that way was a challenge.
And what were the things that you were doing in private practice? Because obviously you're very much kind of, focused on securities with the SEC. In private practice, what were you doing? Were you doing disputes, or were you supporting, securities litigation, or the structuring securities? How did it work?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, I started it sort of in one aspect of private legal practice and moved on to another one. So I started, in the litigation side of the house, securities litigation, coming from the SEC. Part of it was just to take the flip side, if I may, where you do white-collar defense and securities litigation, defending people that would have enforcement actions or criminal actions brought by the Department of Justice. Combined with that would have been more, shall I say, plain vanilla corporate disputes between two corporations, arising from M&A activity or whatever the catalyst may be. So I did that for a period of time. And I think one of the things that I realized, and I think this is understood by most people, particularly the people in the field, is that litigation outside of pure criminal litigation defense practice is a lot more of administrative discovery, depositions, and papers back and forth. You're not really going to go to trial that often. Whereas in the government work, you tend more often to go to trial than not. So I think as I went through that litigation learning curve on the private side, I was happy to be in that advisory capacity, but I don't think I was as enamored with, if I say it plainly, a lot of the paper pushing that went back and forth. So from that perspective, I said, look, wanting to challenge myself and sort of, again, grow sort of my professional caliber, I was able to transition my legal practice as I became more of a mid-level associate to transactional work. So that was across principally what we all call the buy side, representing mutual funds, private equity funds, and hedge funds, whether it's forming them, advising clients and investing in private equity funds, and related matters. That what became my focus following the litigation side. I switched firms, so I had been at Blank Rome doing litigation. Then I went to Wilkie Farr and Gallagher to take on transactional legal practice as a mid-level for a few years.
Right. No, that's really interesting, because now the sort of the next moves in the story, make sense to me, that there was that little transition and that change, because then you faced I think a crossroads that a lot of people will think about, which is whether to go in-house as in an institution, or whether to stay external and service them as a lawyer outside. And you made the decision to go in-house. How did that come about?
Yeah, so again, I think a couple of concepts came into my mind, which again are not surprising, I suppose. First is, what is value? What is the long-term value of a career? And as much as I joked, although it was true, around the quantitative realities of going from the SEC to make more money in private practice, I think then you think about the qualitative realities and the qualitative preferences of how much time do you want to spend with your family. And look, I think a lot of people have been able to balance, work and life very well. But for me, I definitely saw that being in private legal practice was taking away from me disproportionate amount of time that I wanted to spend with my young daughters and my wife. And we have a very big network of family and friends. So from that perspective, I would suppose, whereas the first move was quantitatively driven, I think going in-house was largely qualitative, and qualitative in the sense that also leveraging the knowledge and hoping to go in in an advisory capacity brought me to join an asset management firm on the legal side, which is part of a global financial services firm.
Right. And had you come into contact with them through your practice, and then they liked what they saw and it's like, come along, or what? How did that come about?
So couple of things there. One is that that was a client of the firm, and we were advising them in certain capacities for their buy-side mutual funds, as an example. And also, one of my colleagues who was at my law firm went to work there, and that made the more practical connection, and that transformed that into a reality to join in-house.
Yeah, because I guess we've all experienced this too, that there is a point in your career when you start to build up that network, that network does become very helpful to you, because there is a lot of kind of, it's not just so much what you know, but who you know. People want to have someone reliable come in that they know, and those connections become important too. And that helps you along the way. So you entered as a legal counsel, and the kind of stuff that you were looking at, because this was for the asset management side. This was for, I think, DWS.
Yeah, that's right. So it was called Deutsche Asset Management at the time, which was part of the Deutsche Bank Group. That's right. Yeah. So I joined within the asset management franchise of the bank, in the legal group thereof. Yes.
Right.
Right. Sorry. Tell me the question.
No, that's good. It's just understanding what that role was about in terms of looking at, the kind of things that you might have been looking at just thematically. Obviously, not going to get you to spill the beans on the specifics. Niral.
Yes, well, every good lawyer understands, confidentiality, right? No, look, kidding aside, certainly to talk about in more general terms, I think it was an advisory-oriented role. So the kind of things that we worked on was advising on client queries and client disputes. As one. Number two, it turned out that during that period, there were certain M&A activity related to the asset management franchise, which I, helped to spearhead, having done both litigation and corporate work before. There was a lot of regulatory inquiries. In the U.S., for example, having a lot of pension plan assets, you deal with a lot of inquiries from the Department of Labor. And so related to ERISA, which is the governing statute for pension plans in the U.S. So across, I would say, M&A advisory, client dispute resolution, and regulatory inquiries, that became the focus. Now, of course, you are interfacing with a whole host of people within the broader franchise, not only within the asset management world, but within Deutsche Bank Group, and you're dealing with people in what I think we all know is the first line of defense, which is the actual business. The second line of defense would be my fellow colleagues in legal, compliance, and risk, as well as my colleagues in the internal audit function.
Right. And looking at the calendar or, the history, this is right through the kind of the big boom in credit, right up to the financial crisis.
Yes.
And were you affected by that, sitting
Yes.
in your seat? How did that manifest itself? Because I think it pretty much affected everybody. But I'm very interested in how it would impact someone who was working as a legal counsel.
Yeah, well, I was also laughing when you said that because, as I'll tell you, timing is not my forte. So as I was doing the work in-house, this is, as you rightly said, it was sort of the go-go days of 2005, 2006 into 2007. And I was dealing with a lot of business activity. CDOs were all the rage, as we all remember, or may want to forget. But so I was dealing with a lot of my colleagues in the front office. Clearly, it was very heady days. And I kind of said, well, gee, I'm doing this on the legal side. Maybe I can put my legal sort of expertise more directly into the business side. And the reason I say timing is not my strong suit is because I sort of talked to colleagues, some senior colleagues that I sort of took me on as a mentee. And sure enough, long story short, they asked me to join in an advisory capacity, but sitting within the business. And as luck would have it, thinking of fame and fortune, that was all but assured to me. That was 3 months before Lehman. So there I was, the new guy on the block in the business group with maybe a target on my head because the world was collapsing. And I really had like a, oh my God moment because I was like, what have I done? Because my peers in legal were, so to say, safe, shall we say. Mm. And here I was in a bit of the recent ruins of the business lines. But look, I think from my perspective, and we can talk about this, timing wasn't great, but though the crisis caused a lot of pain to a lot of people in a lot of ways, as relates to our conversation today, I have to say it also brought opportunities.
Well, I think these sort of things do broaden your horizons, right? When you're faced with big challenges. And I imagine, I wasn't in asset management at all. I was completely the other side of the fence. But I would imagine after the meltdown that there was, asset management, Damian, you were involved in it very much so. It's about assets under management. And I imagine there was a big reduction as a result of the crisis. I imagine some firms were better protected than others. You were working for a very, very big firm that had a big investor base, which probably helped. But I think also it's all relative. You probably experienced a big drain too. And I noticed that you went into a role involved in transformation. Was that because the organization needed to reinvent itself? Or, how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think there was a bit of a quick evolution. So I had been asked to come in effectively to help grow a specific line of what was then called our specialty fixed income group within Deutsche Asset Management and help grow it organically and inorganically. Now, as the crisis sort of befell everybody, it became clear that most of those plans were waylaid. And it was a matter of, as you, Nick, were hinting at, it was around rationalizing, streamlining, which product lines were going to stay, which were going to go, how are we going to deal with, as you said, an entirely different client-based framework. So I got involved in transformation. In some ways, I say transformation in the more normal sense of the word. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other transformation work. But the normal sense of the word means I got tasked with what was called product development and management, and it was really looking at our institutional product line. And there was always legal touch points. And I think one of the things I'll sort of give a preview here is a lot of the different things I've done, there's definitely been touch points or bits of overlap with legal matters and regulatory matters. But so I focused the efforts on the institutional product lineup that we had, and looking at client solutions and client issues. And so that was, let's say, the first foray into what I'll call transformational work, which I found very interesting. I found it, obviously, I had a lot of trepidation because, again, I'm still the lawyer guy showing up on the business side. But I think, as luck would have it, we talked about opportunity. there was a need for somebody who had a regulatory and legal lens, which I think held me in very good stead. And I think if I hadn't had that, and maybe just gone to the business side abruptly, the outcome could have been different. But I think people saw that as a nice complement to what the franchise needed at the time. So from my perspective, it was a calculated risk to jump into it. But I have to say, fortuitously, it worked out reasonably well to be able to take on that kind of role, and that expanded as sort of into the wake of the crisis a couple of years. My role expanded as we then started, I think the world started getting a little calmer and people really started thinking about a little bit more on the growth side. What are we going to do? What should our strategy be? How are we going to really grow revenue for the long term? And then I was asked to run the strategy group within our institutional asset management franchise of Deutsche Asset Management.
So you're now about, I guess, 10 to 15 years into your career from starting out. Mm-hmm. And at this point now, are you starting to, maybe you already have, but are you starting to be a hirer yourself? Are you out there now, looking at yourself, realizing you have a skill set, but actually there's other skill sets that you need to bring in from outside? What was that like?
Yeah, it was an interesting time. And by that point, you're right. I think it would have been, so this is around 2010. Yeah. So roughly speaking, 14 years out from law school. Look, at that point, you are definitely considered somebody who's senior, somebody who should be taking responsibility and accountability for what they're doing for the business. Initially, I acquired a couple of internal teams. So I went from being an advisor in a legal capacity to actually having a global team, albeit somewhat small. I think it was about 10 or 12 people to start. But understanding how you manage a global team. People have different personalities and perspectives. There's regional differences in how people manage businesses. So I think that was, as I said, you got to ask a lot of questions. You got to have some answers and you got to be ready to be wrong, right? And I think that was the mantra for me, taking that role on and really getting to a point where now I'm senior. I have to have the accountability. I have to manage teams in an effective manner. I think that's exactly right.
And really, we manage stuff globally now, and it's all very much post-pandemic with sort of teams and VCs and stuff. Managing a global team, like you say there, and regional teams, how was that practically at that time?
Yeah, so look, I think, sort of the virtual world was still nascent at that time and wasn't necessarily as effective and as good as we have it today, which in some ways I think allowed a little more travel, if I'm honest. And I think it was great to then be able to go to Frankfurt or go to Singapore and actually sit down with the team and interact with them and, actually enjoy a dinner perhaps and really get a real sort of interface with your colleagues. So I think, there was a downside that maybe the virtual world wasn't quite as progressed, but the real world, I think we got to partake in a little bit more. So I think that's what I also tried to do. But actually, it's a bit, tough to travel for short periods of time, long distances. But in my mind, it was worth doing. And it was something that allowed me, I think, to understand the ask and the deliverables better.
Right. And I guess at this point, this is pretty much a first line role, right? Mm-hmm. So you've worked in the second line in legal, effectively. You've worked in the first line. And your next move, I think, took you into the third line, into audit. Is that right?
Well, we had the whole digital transformation in between.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
No, that's obviously a huge part. Well, also there was a move to London as well at this point.
That's right. So after my business side roles expanded to be the global chief operating officer of our institutional management franchise, asset management franchise, we had some organizational changes across the broader Deutsche Bank group. Long story short, in talking to some of my people that I consider my mentors, one in particular, next thing I knew, me and my family were on a plane to London to take on a huge platform and technology transformation for both our asset management franchise as well as our wealth management franchise.
Right. And how was that? Because, I've done expat myself, and that's effectively what you are. But I think as a US expat, there's certain things that make it kind of different. For me, it was a great thing to move overseas. I got a lower tax rate and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't work, right? If you're a US citizen, that doesn't work. Is that right?
Taxes in the US and being an American citizen is a bit of a sore subject. So we'll leave that for a different podcast. But yeah, look, it was exciting. Again, we talk about if you want inflection points in your career, you have to take calculated risk. And I have to say my wife is very supportive in that regard. My daughters were at the time, I believe, 10 and 12. precisely the wrong time to uplift them out of a school district and a school framework they were very happy with. They definitely were not happy initially. Luckily, the story ends with them actually being elated in a few years, having come to London. But it was a matter of taking a calculated professional risk, a calculated personal risk, but being ready for adventure, right? And so we came to London circa 2013, the middle of 2013. So it was a combination of a lot of unfamiliar territory. And by that, I mean, personally, being in a new place. London is a great city. Love it. But it was a new city to us, trying to get the girls in school. Making sure my wife felt that she was, doing well and enjoying her time. And then professionally, not only being in a new city and a new office, but taking on a role that was a huge transformational role. I didn't have technology background. And clearly there was, I guess we'll talk about this in a second, but I directly didn't have it. But trying to take on this huge transformational role in somewhat unfamiliar terrain, that was really something from my perspective.
Well, that is interesting because obviously it's a huge technological transformation. And I think also at a time when, the acceleration of how finance uses technology and on what technology becomes available, it's a really kind of, almost a sort of explosion at that point when you're in that role. And what are you doing there? Are you leaning very heavily on your legal training? Because at the end of the day, there's still agreements. There's things you have to think. There's probably territoriality issues. There's data protection issues. There's all kinds of things, right? What are the things that you're getting faced with in this role?
Yeah, so it was definitely an array of issues, right? From the transformation side, we were implementing large-scale platforms across asset and wealth management, negotiating large-scale contracts with the vendors. So clearly the legal sort of perspective was important and very much relevant to what we were doing. But equally, it's working and interfacing with the business, getting them to understand that change is coming. Most people don't, I think all of us for the most part, don't initially like change. So you have to convince them that change is coming, change is going to be good. You have to manage a scale of vendor relationships because you're going to need outside players to help you. And we really did have a lot of people to bring into that. And then managing the P&L associated with doing the transformation, in an effective manner, on time and in budget. So the way I would sort of encapsulate all of that, I certainly, didn't play any of the instruments all that well, but I think I was able to conduct the orchestra using the experts across the different sections of an orchestra, the different types of skill sets, and really conduct this transformational orchestra over the next few years.
And I think that's probably something that a lot of people who enter into management at some point, they have to realize, because, you are your best asset. You yourself are your best asset. But there comes a point where those roles actually get so big that you just have to trust and rely on other people. Is that something that came naturally to you? Or is that not really, you still very much, you want to run things yourself? Or you've never been like that? How does it work for you?
It sounds cliche, but I think most things and success comes when you have a team sport mentality, right? And it is a team sport. I think for anybody to suggest otherwise, no matter what you're doing, it's going to be team sport. You're going to live and die by the people that you have around you. For me, that was really part of the journey, as I call it, to be able to nurture and create teams, have camaraderie, have challenge between one another, work really hard when you need to, have some fun when you can, and really build those relationships where everybody feels that there's something positive that they're doing. You have a common vision. So to me, I wasn't good at to start, but I got better over time as I had different teams, going back to some of my prior roles as well. So to me, that was absolutely one of the best parts of being in unfamiliar terrain, is to be able to rely on the experts, but really get everybody to congeal together as a team, bringing their own strong suits into it.
Now, a bit of a spoiler. I think that a lot of the people you were working with at that time in that role, you've actually gone on into other places with in other roles because you've really, valued and rely on them, and they've become kind of your tribe, your team. Mm-hmm. And you've also, I think at this point, if I ask them, I think a lot of them would say Niral is my mentor. And there's, you've mentioned that you had mentors, but mm-hmm. you're going through a transition now where you're starting to mentor other people. Are you conscious of that? Do you become aware of that? Or, how does that work?
Yeah, you become aware of it. And I think there's a natural selection process around that, right? Between people that want to be in a mentor relationship, people that clearly are exhibiting a real desire to learn, a real desire to collaborate, to spend the time that's required. I think there's a natural selection process where, and that doesn't mean the other people are not necessarily good or bad. They can be in either camp, but you will sort of distill down those people that I think you will have a natural interface with. Although there have been a couple instances where people came to me and asked me to be a mentor, but usually it's just a selection process. And for me, that is again a testament to having that good fortune, having good, strong teams, that I was able to take people into some of the ensuing roles, and they felt reassured enough to do that. And we all commonly, like I said, had our own strengths, but collectively, I think we were that much stronger.
Right. And the next move, I think, as I say, was into the third line and into audit. And was that a move into audit, or was there something else that really brought you in there and excited you, interested you, that you wanted to take that role?
Yeah, so I think, again, there was an evolution organizationally, so certainly there was part of that. But I think the franchise was going through, a particularly turbulent time. I think there was a need, and my mentor had taken on the role of leading the internal audit function at the time, and there was potentially a view that doing independent investigations in a very sort of around some of the complex issues that were arising at the time would be very useful. So a bit atypical to other financial services firm, we created what I'll call the complex investigations function. It was called Group Audit Investigations more plainly. And really, it started off as a very bespoke team. It remained pretty small, but it was a very bespoke team where we're going to do ad hoc independent investigations. I think the regulators and the board were reassured by the fact that we would be sitting within the independent function, i.e. the internal audit function. And so that was, again, a jump into the deep end of the pool once more. Granted, a lot of it relies on legal and regulatory background. But the reality is that you are now going to be tasked with looking at all geographies, all business lines, conduct controls, old stuff, new stuff. And it really was one of the most interesting, occasionally terrifying, and the most edifying roles that I've had, which I did for approximately 5 years.
And it's such an evidential role. You're looking at so much evidence because from our experience of working in similar kinds of stuff, there's a lot of review, looking at communications, and so on. When you think back to when you were working at the SEC, which I think was probably a little bit investigative at that time,
that's right.
How had things changed? Or was it pretty similar? Had that equipped you well for this role, or was this very different?
It gave me a foundation for this role. Look, I think it's always going to be true for anybody that does internal investigation, so it's not limited to any one firm. You are under the microscope. You are going to face a lot of skepticism, at least initially, even though you get overall support, because you're going to be a bearer of bad tidings occasionally. And you're going to have to work with lots of people who have potentially sometimes things to lose in cooperating. So it really is different, because when you're the government, everybody kind of, dare I say, falls into line pretty quickly most of the time. But here, I think it's a bit, you have to win over the audience. You have to show objectivity, independence. You have to sort of prevail over the skepticism that to a degree is understandable, and really provide independent, fact-based outputs. So you are really always going to be against the tide a bit. And I think that's true for all internal investigations in any corporate setting.
In the institution where it's a big institution, quite a big book of work, right? I mean, how did you find trying to manage, because that was a global head role, I think, as well.
Right.
You were looking at stuff across the globe, and I think a number of spinning plates really at the time. I mean, how does that work? Yeah,
it was a global role, and we talked about it. Certainly, shout out to Skadi for helping with some of the core investigations. So thanks to Nick, you and the team. But look, but kidding aside, that's also true. Part of the puzzle was getting the SMEs involved, both internal and external. And they both had unique value, but that role, more than any other one that I had done, would have failed but for making sure you had the right expertise for the right category of issue you were looking at. Because you are now, I am, and the team is looking at across regions. You're looking at, things that relate to the corporate bank. Then you're looking at things that relate to the private bank. And then you're looking at things that relate to asset management. And then you're looking at all kinds of hyper-technical issues too. And there's no person that I know of that could possibly do it themselves. So again, going back to one of the earlier points, it is about convening the right team, because that is definitely a team sport. And the only way we were able to, I think, prevail and really get people to understand that there wasn't an agenda, it was fact-based, was to really rely on our peers, internal and external, that brought that necessary expertise.
And I mean, I don't want to get too salacious, but what I do want to ask you is, when you're working in a role like that, compared to all the roles that you've done before, there must be a different kind of pressure, I'm assuming, because you're dealing with the most intimate difficulties potentially of an organization. And you're really probably, treading into some very, very difficult areas for people, I think, as you've mentioned, versus the kind of stuff you've done previously. I don't think that would have been the same kind of pressures. How are you, finding that when you went into that role?
Yeah, so I think that, I think the way you would potentially give an analogy, before you were swimming with the current, now you're swimming against the current, if I can potentially oversimplify it that way. So I think, again, if for us, it was really relying on objectivity as our, as sort of our primary sort of, let's say, value, right? You have to be objective. You can't bring your own views into this. You have to be dispassionate, is a word that the team used a lot. And you actually have to be willing to stand fast, right? You're going to understandably, sometimes not so understandably, face skepticism. And you have to be able to show that fortitude and stand strong. So this kind of work, you have to come in knowing that victory comes in just doing your work, not necessarily getting all kinds of accolades, because that's not why you should be doing that work. You're wanting to make I grew up in that place. I wanted to make it better. I wanted to make it better for the right reasons. I think the team did have lasting impact in some of the things that we did. I think we really helped elevate some of the views that people had of the franchise. So yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. It's really understanding the importance of those things more than perhaps in some of the other roles.
Right. And that really, leading into the next role, which is where you are now,
Yes.
Chief Ethics Officer at DWS.
Yeah.
That's again a different role, but I think some of those strengths as well. You're drawing on a lot of what you've done throughout your career in that role. Tell me about how that's worked for you now.
Sure. So look, I think, again, a lot of this is, as we call it, concentric circles, right? So there's a legal touch point, there's a business side, touch point, the investigations touch point. You put it all together. One of the things, and again, my mentor, who was on the board at the time at the DWS, along with the then CEO, asked me to come over to create this office. And in a nutshell, I think if you think about all the work that had been done, it was really kind of taking on a preemptive focus. How do we look at culture? How do we look at our governance framework, our escalation mechanisms? And how do we get even further ahead of the curve so that we have to do less investigations, so that we have to do less transformation down the road? What can we do now? And what can we do to strengthen us, our human capital pool, like I said, our overall controls framework, working with our second line, working with our internal audit colleagues. So it was really has been a very interesting role to focus on those things, that preemptive effect of how do we make our culture stronger? How do you have a common vision? How do you share the values that the board has set and make sure that people live and breathe those things? So I've really enjoyed that, of taking what I've learned and now putting it through a different lens and tense and applying it and hoping to make sure that we can ensure, sustainable long-term success.
So looking back, the young lad at Colgate, 1992, they get a look in the crystal ball and they see what the future lies ahead. Are they up for that challenge if they get the opportunity to look forward and see all of the twists and turns that your career has taken? Or do they decide maybe not go to law school and try something else?
Well, the only analogy I could draw is that when I was younger, I did get a lot of speeding tickets, and I used to like to drive fast on very curvy roads. So using that as the backdrop I would have had way back when, I probably would have said, bring it on. I mean, knowing that it would have been a rough road, but hey, why not? So, and whatever, in this role currently and whatever awaits next, ready for the next adventure.
Well, what is the next adventure? What would you like? I know you're happy now, but where would you find fulfillment, do you think, looking forward?
Yeah. So again, I think from my perspective is, how do I marry my values, my strengths, and what will ultimately, from a corporate perspective, make me happy? And I think it is to really provide meaningful advisory inputs and transformational advice for corporations that either need it or will soon need it or recognize they need it. Because I think that is something that I can do well with the inputs of lots of other very smart people. So to me, I've always said that, you have to ensure that the journey remains the destination, because I don't think there is a destination in the corporate world. I think what you do and the things I was privileged enough to get to do through a combination of the right people being my mentors, hard work, luck, organizational change, you name it. To me, I'm happy that I'm still on this journey. That is certainly always going to remain my destination, which is to have meaningful, fun work to do. And make sure that I spend enough time with my family and my friends, because life is short. And, I have my management mantras. So I'm happy to share them with you if you want, Nick.
Go on, Niral. What's the management mantras?
Yeah, people always say, what are the management mantras? So I have 4. You gotta say something, impactful at the end, right? So to close, look, I've sort of put these 4 down because I think that represents the way I work and the way I would want to work. First is efficiency over effort, meaning FaceTime to me has little value. Micromanagement is actually counterproductive. So efficiency over effort, trust your people, give them latitude and let them grow. One team, one dream. That was my mentor saying, but I actually believe it. Make sure everybody understands what they're doing, why. Make sure people feel comfortable to ask questions, take opposing views, and really have a discussion around that. The third one is what I call we for the wins and I for the incompletions. Because I think being a good manager, barring exigent circumstances, is really about ensuring that your team understands that when you win, it's a team sport. And when you don't, for the most part, if there's honesty involved in the mistakes, it's your job as manager to take that on. That's the distinction, I think, of a good manager, at least in my opinion. And lastly, going back to my investigations role, and probably all of it in some ways, objectivity over appeasement of all forms. Some people manage up, some people manage down. I think ultimately for most things, there are a lot of objective truths. What happened, why it happened, or is this transformation good? Are we going to get it done on time? Will it come within budget? Whatever it is, face the music. Don't just take the easy way out, and then whatever happens, happens.
Niral, thank you very, very much for that look back over what has been a fascinating career.
I feel much older at the end of this podcast. Thank you.
No, we've really appreciated it. And you'll be welcome back on the Skadi Podcast. Perhaps we can find some other stuff for you to talk about too. But thank you very much for giving your time to us. It's been really appreciated.
I thank you for your time. It's been a very pleasurable thing to do. And thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Skadi Podcast. On the discussion panel today was Nick Corry, Damian Taylor, and Niral Kalaria. If you want to listen to more episodes, just find us by searching the Skadi Podcast on any streaming platform. Feel free to connect to us at Skadi Limited on LinkedIn to read about our research and business relation to anti-financial crime and control functions.